Middle East, a modern name for a region shaped by millennia of conflict and faith. From the Crusades to the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, its history is marked by sacred visions and imperial designs. And we understand its present shape by studying its layered past. I'm Paul Lay, and today I'm pleased to be joined by Brendan Sims. Today we're going to discuss the mess that is the Middle East and a possible solution by looking back to the Peace of Westphalia of 1648 that brought an end to the brutalities of the 30 Years' War. Brendan, just tell us about that model.
The Westphalia for Middle East program at the Centre for Geopolitics regards Westphalia not so much as a model, although I don't object to that phrase, but rather more as an inspiration. A model, of course, is an exact structure or framework which you can't just replicate. However, what we are arguing is that the 30 Years' War had many of the same structural features as the current conflict in the Middle East. You've got religious differences, you've got political differences, you've got disputes between great powers which are impacting on the situation, and you have a conflict which has been going on for as long as anybody can remember. And it was very difficult for people in Germany in, let's say, the early 1640s to imagine how their country, indeed Central Europe, could be returned to some kind of peaceful coexistence. And yet, the treaties of Westphalia in 1648, as you say, gave them a way out. And it established a series of principles which underpinned the peacemaking, which in Germany itself was surprisingly long-lasting.
But it seems a very different model. We have that. What I think we don't understand about the 30 Years' War, what is not appreciated, I think particularly from an Anglophone perspective, is the sheer brutality, the sectarian brutality of that. And that seems to be the inspiration as to why you would seek that as a model or whatever whatever phrase you wish to refer to. And yet, we're speaking on a day when Israel has attacked Iran in quite a profound, big way, much more expansive than perhaps we might have thought. It seems an awful long way away. What was it about the Treaty of Westphalia, the Peace of Westphalia, that made it a success? What were those? Because to transform from those terrible events that began in 1618, ended in 1648, affected the whole, or almost the whole, of the Western European continent, Mitteleuropa. What is it that made it a success? It's quite intangible in many ways to focus on that.
Essentially because it delivered on three levels. It delivered on the level within the individual polity, so a power-sharing arrangement within some of the states, or in fact they call them estates of the Holy Roman Empire. Secondly, the relationship between those estates or component parts of the Holy Roman Empire and each other and the emperor. And thirdly, at the level of the great powers. So Germany had become a disaster zone. On the one hand, it was sucking in outside powers, like France, like Sweden, like Spain. On the other hand, these powers were also using Germany as the kind of springboard, or the cockpit, really, of their own great power rivalries. So the Westphalian settlement worked at all these three levels, and it was comprehensive. That was a very, very important feature, because there had been many attempts since the start of the 30 Years' War in 1618 to end the conflict, some quite early on. But they all failed because they didn't address all three levels. So they might address the relations between the princes and the emperor, for example, but not the interest of, say, France or Sweden, or the other way around. And the other aspect was that many of these earlier proposals were partial, as I said, and therefore you might resolve one part of the problem, but then the outbreak of war or the continuation of war in another part of Germany would radicalize those areas which had been pacified. And that's very similar to the Middle East. We've seen, for example, in Iraq, after the so-called awakening at the end of the early 2000s, Iraq was then re-radicalized. It was never totally pacified, obviously, but it was re-radicalized by the outbreak of the revolution in Syria. And you could think of other examples. So in the Middle East, we will never have a solution unless we address all the problems that make up the current conflict, whether that's Israel-Palestine, whether that's Syria, whether that's Lebanon, whether that's perhaps Iraq, whichever bit. They all need to be addressed together. And at the same time, we need to have an arrangement which appeals to the outside powers. So at Westphalia, the great power of France and what had just become the great power of Sweden became guarantors of the settlement along with the other parties to the treaty. So everybody guaranteed the treaty. And the result was not the end of great power conflict in Europe. The war between France and Spain continued, but Germany was basically taken out of that conflict. And so our hope would be that a settlement in the Middle East would not necessarily end the great power confrontation between the United States and Russia or the United States and China, but it would at least ensure that the Middle East was no longer the cockpit of those rivalries and to give the region a chance to recover.
And when we look at the conflict that arose in 1618, it's almost 100 years to the year of Luther's Reformation. And the 30 Years' War is a product, to a certain extent, of that split between Catholic and Protestant European powers, and in Germany particularly, this cockpit of sectarianism that was there with many, many bishoprics, prince-bishoprics, small states. And yet, all of them, all of the powers that were part of this conflict, whether great or small, could call upon a common Christian inheritance and understood it in their own particular terms. That's not entirely true of the Middle East, and particularly the case of Israel there, and also the division, which has some resonance with sectarianism between Shia and Sunni Islam, particularly the case of Iran. How does that pattern relate to the modern day idea of a Peace of Westphalia in the Middle East and the original process there?
Well, as you quite rightly say, Germany is religiously deeply divided ever since the Reformation. And the key question is not so much the difference between Lutherans and Catholics. That had really been at the heart of the religious wars of the 16th century, which had been brought to an end by the Treaty of Augsburg, which enunciated the principle of cuius regio, eius religio. In other words, whoever is in charge, or the prince of a particular state or estate, he will then determine the religion of that territory. That turned out not to work, and it turned out for a number of reasons, partly because it didn't allow for conversions, it didn't allow for movement in religious patterns within a territory, but also, very importantly, it did not recognize the interests of the Calvinists. And these were recognized in the Treaty of Westphalia. So I mention that because it shows that you need to take on board new actors. So one thing that would be very important in any settlement in the Middle East is to recognize that it's not only states who are important. So, for instance, Hezbollah in Lebanon is in some ways stronger than the state. So to envisage a solution in the Middle East that doesn't somehow address the question of Hezbollah and its role within Lebanon is simply not viable. So as far as the common heritage is concerned, you're quite right to emphasize that at least what Germans did have in common is that they were members of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. And that was a great heritage. And they were really arguing about how that heritage was to be reinvented and developed in the new era. So, as I said earlier, it's not an exact model. But I would say that if you leave aside, and it's a very important issue, Israel-Palestine, where you have a completely different trajectory of a state in the shape of Israel, and you, to a certain extent, leave outside Iran, the rest of the area is actually one which is very much still characterized by the common Ottoman inheritance, which is not so very different from the common inheritance of the Holy Roman Empire. So in some ways, drawing on those Ottoman traditions, trying to define a space of shared sovereignty. One of the features of the Westphalian Treaty was that the individual states did not have state sovereignty. It's a great myth that Westphalia is the invention of state sovereignty and the international system that we know today. That was made up by international relations experts. For perfectly understandable reasons, but it is a myth. And so what made Westphalia work is that in large parts of Germany, you had a sphere of what one might call shared sovereignty, where the princes had to accept that they were no longer in exclusive control of a territory and no longer able just to oppress their subjects at will. In fact, those subjects had the right to appeal to imperial courts. And our hope is that one could define a space in the current Middle East to be made up perhaps of present-day Syria, of Lebanon, maybe Iraq, which would be an area of shared sovereignty, would be essentially a common space, which would have institutions to which its citizens could appeal. And this would be an arrangement which in turn would be guaranteed not only by the citizens of that space itself, that would be level one, seconded level two by the states of the region, in other words, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Israel, but finally also by the outside powers, be they Russia, United States, Britain, European Union perhaps, and China. So that is the way I would see the inspiration working, not in an exact parallel between the two cases, because of course there are many differences.
Of course, yeah. The guarantor problem, if I may call it that, when we look back at 1648, you mention France, great power, Sweden, then a great power as guarantors. And when this proposal appeared, say, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, this idea of a Peace of Westphalia for the Middle East, you'd have had a pretty stable United States, a Russia that had not invaded Ukraine. The guarantors, the possibilities, the options of guarantors now seems more problematic than it did just a few years ago, certainly before the invasion of Ukraine, certainly before Donald Trump's second presidency. How do you address that? Because that seems problematic now as to who would be the guarantor of a peace process.
Well, you make a very good point. Having said that, the guarantor powers at the time of the Treaty of Westphalia were to a certain extent also at war with each other. It is true that France and Sweden were not at war. They, in fact, were allied, basically, during this period. But France and Spain was really the backstop to the emperor, they continued to fight for another 12 years, until 1660. So, as it were, a global antagonism between the prospective guarantors is not in any sense an objection to the acting as guarantors for a Middle Eastern settlement. In fact, it is the reason for it. It is to take exactly the Middle East out of their dispute, a recognition that it benefits neither side to continue the slaughter and the instability in the Middle East. Now, as far as Russia is concerned, of course, the position has changed in relation to 5 years ago, in the sense that Russia is no longer present physically in Syria. Russia has lost its position. It is, to a certain extent, on a back foot in the region. This would, I think, be a large incentive for Putin to agree a guarantor arrangement. As far as the Americans are concerned, they have made clear their intent to reduce their global footprint, to draw down forces wherever they can. So for them, also, a guarantor function, which is not called upon, which is exactly the Westphalian model, should be attractive. So I think actually, structurally perhaps, things are moving in the Middle East in such a way as to make such a settlement possible.
And Trump does seem committed. If there is anything that he's consistent about, it is the idea that he seems to like peace.
That is certainly his rhetoric, and I believe he is actually sincere.
Yes, I do.
In his own mind about this. And what is perhaps even more important in the Middle Eastern context is that, and it's not surprising as a real estate mogul, he sees the economic potential, not just of the energy, but well beyond that, of tourism, of development, hence the rather bizarre and, to my mind, very distasteful video he produced about Gaza. But what's underlying that is a strong belief, which was also driving the Abrahamic Accords, which he sponsored during his first administration, the underlying belief that there is a huge amount of economic potential to be unlocked. And we see this not just in the American policy, we see this also with India, with the India-Middle East Economic Corridor. We see this in China's interest in maintaining the steady energy supply. There are many interests in the Middle East which are destabilizing the region, but there are also many, and I think much greater ones, which want to stabilize it. And you can only stabilize it with the region, not against the region.
And there are real success stories in the Middle East. If we look at the Emirates, if we look at Dubai, these are places that are booming economically, also seem to have a cultural footprint now that was not there just a few years ago. And I wonder what the perspective is from there. It's one thing to think of it, we're looking at it from a European perspective there. But I wonder about parts of the Middle East. We tend to think from a European, from a Western perspective, of it as a basket case, as a place of terrible, and indeed it is a place of horrific, almost insoluble problems. And yet there are huge success stories in the Middle East, where we see it almost pioneering new economic and cultural models. And I wonder what the perspective is from there, from places like Dubai, for example.
Well, you're quite right that parts of the Middle East, particularly in the Gulf, have now become a brand. In fact, they're attracting migration, particularly from the UK, tens of thousands going out. And there's huge interest in the region in some kind of general settlement. And you see, particularly in the case of Oman, a country which has maintained connections for a long time to all parties in the conflict, and in particular between acting as a facilitator between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So that is a strand which can be built upon. There is the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement, brokered, at least on the surface, by China. And you also have not merely the good news stories from the Gulf, which you mentioned, but also, rather unexpectedly, the fall of Assad. And even more unexpectedly, so far, his replacement with somebody in the shape of Mr. Shara, who, whatever his background in radical Islamism, which cannot be denied, is at the moment seemingly trying to stabilize Syria on a multi-faith, power-sharing basis. Now, that could change, but for the moment, people tend to give him the benefit of the doubt. The Americans are doing that. I think that's the right decision until we learn otherwise. And of course, in Lebanon, it's a very difficult situation, but Hezbollah has been damaged, but it has not been eliminated. It cannot be eliminated as a political force, but it is no longer in a position to attack Israel in the way that it once was. So the Middle East is, unfortunately, has been rich with very unpleasant surprises, not least the very brutal attack of 6th of October 2023, 7th of October 2023. But it also has some pleasant surprises. And I think that what's happened in Syria, the Saudi-Iranian dialogue, the economic interests, all of these can be knitted together in a way as to make a Westphalian style solution possible.
And you now have genuinely successful states that you can point to and say, that's the future for the Middle East. This is the reality. This is the real thing that happens there. You mentioned Dubai, obviously. But Israel remains this key issue. And so one can imagine Arab states, whether Sunni and Shia, even Iran, ultimately being incorporated into that. But what's the role and position of Israel in that?
Well, that is obviously a critical issue. It's not, in fact, the critical issue. I think if we were having this conversation 3 or 4 years ago, we would probably have mentioned Israel 3rd or 4th or 5th down the line. We would have been much more focused on Syria.
Yeah.
Having said that, Israel is a very important issue. And of course, since October 23, has gained much more salience than had been the case over the last 10 years. I think the issue isn't so much Israel itself. And when I say Israel, I mean Israel within the internationally recognized borders of 1967. I think that Israel will continue to exist within those borders. It should exist within those borders. What we're really talking about is what we do with Palestine, which is Gaza and the West Bank. And there, I think, the solution will need to be, first of all, an end to the conflict, which removes Hamas as a military threat to Israel, but also does not involve the displacement of the Palestinians from Gaza, and also a settlement that stops what appears to be a policy of slow strangulation in the West Bank, with the building of settlements, the various attacks, settler activities, which we've recently seen sanctioned by the UK government. So the settlement, the resolution for Palestine will need some sort, probably, of federation of Gaza and the West Bank with the wider shared territory that I mentioned earlier, or with one of the constituent states, for example, Jordan in the case of the West Bank, and Egypt in the case of Gaza. So the Palestinian people will have to be brought into a wider political settlement, which gives them a voice, but in a framework that doesn't leave those spaces as areas from which attacks can be launched on Israel.
With my historian's hat on, I think one tends to be pessimistic about things. And I think about the Treaty of Westphalia. It's a huge success story. You mention all the myths around it about this idea that it produces the nation state, the sovereign nation state. And I've heard that endlessly. I think I was even taught that as an undergraduate, that this was the received idea. What followed the Treaty of Westphalia, which brought an end to 30 years of horrific warfare, was followed by European wars of the 18th century, was followed by the Napoleonic Wars, was followed by the First and Second World Wars, which were, to this day, the most brutal struggles the world has known. We had the Holocaust. Is there a sense in which places work themselves towards this through a kind of brutality? Is this not a demographic issue? There's a lot of young people in the Middle East, a lot of young men with nothing to do, as there were in 17th, 18th, 19th century Europe. Mm-hmm. How much is this something that can be imposed or worked out, or is it a process a culture has to go through? Mm-hmm. That's my fear when everything is proposed. I mean, we know that treaties and peace processes work. We know that it happened in Northern Ireland, for example, Ireland. Mm-hmm. They do work, and yet, looking from a historical perspective, one has to be pessimistic or at least cautious.
Well, you're quite right. As historians, we have to be skeptical, and usually we are pessimistic. However, one of the really interesting things about the process leading to Westphalia, the 3 to 4 year process of negotiation, is that it actually went in tandem with the war. Mm. So the argument that you have to wait for exhaustion is a powerful argument, and it's not completely wrong. There has to be an element of exhaustion, but there also needs to be a process. And we need, I think, to get out of the idea that we just wait until everybody gets tired and you then have peace. That's not what happened.
That's 3 centuries.
That's not what happened at Westphalia. What happened is that the negotiation and the fighting went in tandem. And so that's why I think we can't start early enough in the Middle East. Mm. But it has to be comprehensive. And insofar as anybody is excluded, it needs to be on a very specific and justified basis. So in the case of Westphalia, the Bohemian rebels with whom the whole thing started in 1618, they were in fact excluded and their interests were not recognized. I could see a situation where Hamas, for example, will not be part of any settlement because of what happened on the 7th of October and also because of the military realities. But I would see Hezbollah and many other actors as being represented. So we need to start that comprehensive discussion as soon as possible.
And we need some optimism. So thank you, Brendan Sims. Thank you very much.